You know, folks, history podcasts and history shows and history media can do so much more than just enlighten the past. We can bring to your attention organizations in the contemporary world that do so much good work that's related in many ways to history. And I'd like to tell you about the Sovereign Bodies Institute. Sovereign Bodies Institute builds on indigenous traditions of data gathering and knowledge transfer to create, disseminate, and put into action research on gender and sexual violence against indigenous people. SBI is committed to conducting, supporting, and mobilizing culturally informed and community-engaged research on gender and sexual violence against indigenous people, uplifting indigenous researchers, knowledge keepers, and data visualists in their work to discover and disseminate data on this violence against indigenous people, and empowering indigenous communities and nations to continue their work to end gender and sexual violence against indigenous people. Please go to sovereign-bodies.org to find out more and to contribute to their important work.
Ladies and gentlemen, the sound you hear is a buzzsaw ripping through a painting of George Washington chopping down cherry trees. It's time for Professor Buzzkill, busting myths and taking names.
Here we are on Professor Buzzkill, busting myths and taking names. And fortunately for all of you buzzkillers out there, we have on the line Dr. Liza Black, Assistant Professor of History and Native American and Indigenous Studies at Indiana University, who's here to talk to us about picturing Indians, Native Americans in film, 1941 to 1960. Thanks for coming on the show, Professor Black.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. So I would like to start by saying that I am coming to you from Ventura, California, which is Chumash land. Chumash Nation is the past, present, and future caretakers of the land on which I am inhabiting.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit more about your background? I know that you're a citizen of Cherokee Nation, and how did you get into this sort of work, become a historian of these issues?
I had really great professors. I did not enjoy high school whatsoever. I thought it was terrible. I grew up in a town where I didn't feel like I made any sense or really sort of fit in. And then I went to college. And I encountered professors there who were professors of history, who were just incredibly engaging. I went to UC Santa Cruz. I met Martha Hodes there, and she's a professor at NYU. She writes about slavery. She writes about interracial relationships. She writes about Abraham Lincoln. And she was just an incredible faculty mentor. So I would say Martha and other faculty as well at UC Santa Cruz were just such gifted teachers and were so generous with their time that it inspired me not only to major in history as an undergrad, but to then go on to graduate school and major in or get a master's degree and a PhD in history. And then I was lucky enough that once I went to graduate school, I also had incredible faculty. Richard White was my advisor in graduate school. He's the author of many books. Middle Ground is sort of what became sort of really a famous book in Native American history, and he was an incredible mentor and still is, really.
Well, speaking of generous with time, Buzzkiller should know that Dr. Black is very, very kind, because I messed up the original recording of this interview a couple of weeks ago, and she very, very kindly agreed to come on again and enlighten us about this, about her research and about this new book, which is just out from University of Nebraska Press, as I say, Picturing Indians, Native Americans in Film, 1941 to 1960. It's on the Buzzkill bookshelf, and of course our Patreon members will get a chance to win a copy, but I'll talk about that more after the break. Professor, how did you hit upon this specific topic?
A couple of things, again, kind of going back to faculty. So I was in graduate school, and I had written my senior thesis on Cherokee women. Was very, very determined to write a dissertation on Cherokee Nation and on women in particular. And then I took this class with Lori Sears on it was on methodology, but there was just a lot of cultural studies in the class. And I just was totally transfixed by this literature. And I started thinking more and more about Native people in pop culture and representations of Native people in pop culture. And then sort of in the midst of all of that, I was in this Native American student group, and we would hang out a lot. When we weren't working on something, we would just hang out together. And so one night we were hanging out, and we were eating and visiting at someone's apartment, and we were watching this television show in which one of our members was an extra on the show. And it was just so interesting to watch this show against the narrative of the show and to just be looking for Victor. We were all just looking for Victor and getting really excited when he came on the screen, even though that's not where we were supposed to be looking, because he was just a background extra. And then we were also sort of really interested in the fact that he was making so much money. He was the only one amongst us who was working off campus, making really good money and really not expending much effort at all to just walk on scene, sit at a table and pretend to drink coffee. So I think it was those two combined that made me change my topic to movies and got me really interested in representations of Native people, but also more so the question of how do Native people manage to survive economically in this world that is not of their making.
Yeah, it's very interesting because although I would love to read more books on the representation of Native Americans in films and in questions of imagery and historical accuracy and all that sort of thing, this book, what surprised me so much and what drew me to it so much was that it's about the work of Native Americans in Hollywood rather than just the images. I mean, both are important, but the actual work of extras and all sorts of other people seems to be a totally new way to look at these films and a totally way to look at the cultural representations in these films.
Right. I appreciate that you appreciate that. I started working when I was 12 years old. So I have certainly worked a lot, and I've been working ever since. So I have certainly worked a lot of jobs, thought a lot about work. And as a historian, I think it's a category of analysis that sort of fell into disuse. And for some reason, people just aren't talking about labor history so much anymore. And perhaps that's because it got caught up in all this sort of Marxist analysis. But I still find labor and work and employment really useful ways of looking at the lives of sort of ordinary people in American history.
Right.
So for me, it wasn't terribly unobvious to think about film as a place where people are working.
Right.
But apparently it is a quite unique way of looking at movies. We tend to look at movies in the way that the studios want us to look at them, which is to sort of get caught up in them emotionally.
Right.
In whatever way they're trying to direct our emotions. We're supposed to get caught up in it emotionally, but I did not get caught up in it emotionally watching these films. I was very curious about how much is he making? How much is she making?
Yeah.
I wanted to, but I think about those things all the time wherever I am.
Well, a lot of our listeners are historians. A lot of our listeners are history students and history teachers. It seems to me that the archival material for this sort of specialty, this sort of focus, might be very rich because Hollywood is this massive businesses, have got to keep accounting records of all this stuff. It's a great seam, a great mine, I should say, a great seam within a great mine of historical research. Did you find that when you started working on it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I think that that's something Hollywood tries to hide from us. They don't want us to think of them as a corporation. They don't want us to think of them as a profit-making machine, but that is what they are. That is absolutely what they are.
Sure.
So I found tremendous records in the archives, all sorts of pay records, just all kinds of budget records. And this has been totally understudied, in my opinion, by film historians. Film historians, I feel, have focused on, just other issues. But yes, there's a tremendous number of resources there. And I'm sure somebody could come along and look at the records I looked at and come up with a completely different analysis. So the door is now open to rewrite what I wrote.
Well, and you've opened it, and I think it means for other film studies students or other film historians that they're researching the work of extras especially is a wide open field that needs more attention. But let's get to the sort of question of how, for instance, Native Americans got into the movies as actors, what you sort of open your book with in the first couple of chapters. How does this happen?
Well, the short answer, at least the one I give in the book, is that this, in a sense, started with the first contact between Native people and Europeans. Columbus brought Native people back to Spain and put them on display for the king and queen.
Yeah.
But that's going way back. You could also talk about the Wild West shows as a place of employment for Native people, in which Native people were inhabiting representations of themselves, being hired by Buffalo Bill to go on tour and to reenact these historical moments that the non-Native public was quite caught up in.
Right.
And this continued in museums and film throughout the 20th century.
So there's a cultural continuity.
Right, but I mean, I would say it goes all the way back to Columbus.
Yeah, sure. But what's so interesting about the book, one of the many things so interesting about the book, is that almost all the time, Native Americans are used as extras or background, and that often in leading roles, when there's a Native American character, that's given to a white person in, if you will, redface. I don't know if redface is a term that was used at the time, like blackface was, but that comes across very strongly in the book.
Yes, and that's another point I'm trying to make. I appreciate that. That's another point I'm trying to make, in that I'm trying to underscore how the very writing of scripts perpetuates these inequalities in the film industry.
Right.
So I'm not only trying to say that Hollywood is a place of employment, whose goal is to generate profit, but also that these scripts sort of predetermine who will get hired. So yes, it's extremely rare that you had a Native person who was a lead character or even a secondary sort of lead character.
Right.
Meaning somebody who has substantial screen time, somebody who's speaking in monologues, somebody who is really part of the script and memorizing lines. That paid more. That will always pay, but still pays more.
Sure.
So that was almost entirely, though, the domain of white men and white women who, like you say, were in red face. And I feel that is still too much the case now. Now, the question of red face, I don't know that they used red face at the time.
Yeah.
The person I know uses red face is Professor Michelle Raheja, who wrote a book called Reservation Realism.
Right.
And Raheja does not distinguish between Native people in red face and non-Native people in red face. I do. I held strong, and I have separate chapters on non-Native people and how they got paid, and Native people and how they got paid. I also have separate chapters on non-Native people in red face and Native people in red face. To me, those are two distinct phenomena.
What is the difference in how they got paid? And was there also a difference in, there must have been, especially with the star and extra distinction, working conditions?
What I found was that Native people were not hired in large numbers in LA. When you had large numbers of people working as extras, that occurred outside of LA, all over the United States and even Canada. So to that end, they could get around the Screen Extra Guild rules.
Oh, I see.
Yes. And what I found is that they were paid fairly close to the wages that would have been paid through the Screen Extras Guild, or according to Screen Extras Guild guidelines, that is. So I didn't find that they were paid tremendously less than extras would have been paid in LA. I also found that pay was actually fairly substantial, meaning it was more than they would have been paid doing, say, manual labor on their reservation, like mining work, for instance, on Navajo Nation. So in terms of what they were paid, it was less than what extras would have been paid in LA, but more than they would have been paid doing dangerous manual labor.
Right.
In terms of these actors, Native men, really only men, who were playing significant Native parts, who lived in LA, and this was their primary job, was as performers and actors, they never made anywhere near the amount that famous white men who played Indians made. For instance, Rock Hudson or Charles Bronson.
Right.
But when those men played native parts, they made substantial amounts of money. They lived in prestigious neighborhoods in LA and they owned homes. The native men who worked as performers and actors in LA were renters their entire life.
Yeah. Well, one of the things about the Rock Hudson example that was so strong in the book is that there's this sort of famous prop that's used, what you call the Indian nose, in the book, and well, I don't want to ruin the story for the Buzzkills. I'd rather hear from you. That fascinated me as something that that prop continues on for years. That individual prop.
Right. I became also fascinated when I got to these film archives, which are sprinkled throughout LA, and opened these records and found records not only of pay, but these records about makeup and costumes and hair, really detailed records of exactly what these items were, exactly how much they cost, and exactly how many they had. And often, if they could, they would stamp the boxes that held these objects with property of, and then the studio's name.
Right.
And just all sorts of conversations about, well, how much should we spend on these wigs? And could we get away with this $100 wig instead of the $250 wig? And so in addition to brown paint that they called Indian makeup and beaded wigs that they called Indian wigs, braided wigs that they called Indian wigs, they used rubber noses. They would attach rubber noses to lead characters. So folks who were close to the camera doing close-up shots, those people would often have a rubber nose attached to their face to make their nose more pronounced and make it conform to the expectations of the imagined male Indian nose. And yes, I did find records that one particular nose that was a bit expensive did make the rounds and appear on several different non-native men playing Indian characters.
But that seems to be the main distinguishing character aspect of their portrayal, because as you very expertly detail in the book, the nose seems to come from this aquiline Roman vision of a native person's nose, and it's even used. It's the same sort of nose profile used on what we would call a buffalo nickel, what coin collectors would call a buffalo nickel. The younger buzzkillers won't know what we're talking about, which had a Native American on the front, or the obverse, or the head side of the coin, and that iconography in itself was fascinating to me.
Yes, and I do talk a bit about that and about this idea of the silhouette.
Right.
The silhouette, at that time at least, could easily and quickly signify a native person. I think the feather also, the headband with the attached feather and the two braids also sort of became iconic in the 20th century to represent a native person. And that absolutely 100% is true of these extras who were in the background of these films. And that was true whether or not they were native people.
Was there any attempt by Hollywood or the producers and the scriptwriters, and in theory, the historical consultants, to determine whether these things were actually part of Native American culture? Now, of course, one of the major problems is, of course, they lump all Native Americans into one culture, and of course, there are hundreds and hundreds of different cultures. But did you run across any meetings where someone says, "Well, wait a minute, I see Native Americans all the time, and they're not walking around with braids or whatever." Was it very much an artificial, imagined image?
Well, that's interesting, because I would say that they did not necessarily lump them all together. They would often give tribal names, but they would just be completely wrong.
Okay, yeah.
They would just be completely wrong about these histories, or their interpretations were just so skewed that, like, for me, I had to keep asking myself, did it happen that way?
Yeah.
Did it happen that way? I've got to stop watching these movies. I watched about 300 of them, and I would start to lose my own sense of what was true and what was false. So they did often claim that these were certain tribes that they were representing, and certain moments in the past that they were representing. But it's sort of like the fun house at the fair. It's very disorienting to be inside of these narratives and lose sense of true and false. So they did represent tribes.
I mean, the question of actual authenticity, because it seems to me so many things that's so strange about Hollywood in history is they'll go to extraordinary lengths to get the details of a dress correct, and then have the historical character do something completely ahistorical. And so I wonder if anyone says, well, wait a minute, we should, or maybe would make a better film if we tried to understand what actually happened, or how people actually dressed and how their societies worked.
Yeah, so in fact, the studios, I found, according to their own records, this isn't just me making accusations, according to their own records and their own archives, they actually did at times seek historical truth. They did, in fact, at times seek to represent tribes accurately. Mm-hmm. However, in doing so, they brought their sort of lack of ethics to the table. And I found one particular document that said, dig up a good Indian historian and have him just lie and say that what we've lied about is true.
Oh, so it's
just look for someone until you find someone who can do that. And so I found that chapter really fascinating, because the studios absolutely made these efforts. They absolutely went out there and sought out scholars and sought out scholarship, but they either would just sort of give up and cut it out. Once they were actually editing, they would just cut it out. It didn't really matter. It really wasn't in service to the larger narrative that they were telling.
Yeah.
In that Native people really didn't matter in the larger narrative they were telling. I mean, they're really telling a story about the stars, and meaning their feature characters, and Native people are, from their perspective, peripheral. Nonetheless, they did make that effort, and there were even efforts to include actual indigenous languages. They would hire these technical advisors who either were Native or had some experience with Native people and had some indigenous language skills, who would try to teach actors some of their lines in Native languages. But again, to the studio's perspective, this didn't really matter.
Right.
Because what they would usually do when they were representing a Native language is they would just tell the actor to just speak in gibberish.
That's astounding. That's just astounding. It's almost as if it makes it hard. They're trying to make it harder to do. I would think maybe this is because of a late 20th or early 21st century perspective, that it's easier just to get it right because maybe we have more information now or whatever, but it just seems to be to go to these extraordinary lengths just so they could have in the credit, historical consultant, so-and-so and so-and-so.
Yeah, and I mean, it really is, I think, just deeply insulting to Indigenous people, because it doesn't sort of see them as being a real part of the audience. It doesn't see them as people who will see this movie and who will say, well, that's not how our language sounds, or that's not how we would say it. And that's insulting.
Sure. Well, this is a very good time for us to take a little bit of a break, so please listen up, Buzzkillers, and we'll be back in a moment. Buzzkillers, I know you like listening to me bust myths about American history and about other history, and that's why I want to introduce you to another podcast that I think you're going to like. Well, no, I know you're going to like it. Paradigm is a podcast about the experiences that shape the way we walk through the world. Each episode features a new storyteller taking us inside today's biggest issues to reveal the way those issues impact individuals. One episode that I really think you'll enjoy is called Canary in the Coal Mine. It's all about how coal mining took hold in Appalachia. Here's a little clip.
See, they owned the housing the people lived in. They owned the stores, and they would pay you half of your paycheck in their own money that they made. And the only place you could spend it was in their store. And everything in those stores was about twice as high as it was anywhere else. And that's one thing the unions helped the miners on right there.
You can find Paradigm on their Frequency Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, we're back, Buzzkillers, with Dr. Liza Black, who's talking to us about Picturing Indians, Native Americans in Film, 1941 to 1960. And Professor, before we went to the break, we were talking about all kinds of things in the early parts of the book, but perhaps the most central chapter is chapter 5, where you talk about the transformation of Indians to movie Indians. That seems to be essential in both the process at the time and in how you're analyzing it.
Right. So it was really incredible to find that these native people that they went to great lengths to find and negotiate with and to hire and to generate pay records for and to relocate all of their equipment out to these reservations and other all over the United States and Canada, that in addition to that, they planned ahead of time to ship out boxes of Indian wigs and boxes of Indian paint, that they called it, and boxes of these synthetic buckskins.
Yeah.
That was really quite astonishing to me, and perhaps astonishing to the extras as well.
It's an enormous amount of work to create something that it sounds like, if Hollywood is worried about the bottom line, they might just ask people to show up in their normal dress.
Right, but then that would not tell the audience these are native people of the past.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, in that sense, their determination to keep native people in the past meant that they had to costume them, but with their profit motive in mind, they put them in some really goofy costumes.
Yeah, and presumably ahistorical and all sorts of other things.
Well, I mean, they look like they came out of a bag from a Halloween store.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's certainly true. Was there ever any pushback, or certainly ever any organized pushback from Native American actors against this trend? Because it's obviously they've been in films since the 20s or 30s. You know, there must have been was there any sort of response to this over Hollywoodization, if you will?
I would say that the response was sort of on a person by person basis. Once they were already hired and on set, they might complain a bit about things. I mean, one of my chapters is called "It's a Bit Too Thick." Yeah. Which is this Navajo man is complaining when they're putting the makeup on him that they're doing it a bit too thick. And I feel like that's his way of saying this whole thing is a bit too thick, right?
Yeah, sure.
That sort of the distance between who I am and who you are presenting me to be is just too thick. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I found a lot of moments like that where Native people would sort of push back kind of gently in conversation with the makeup artist. And then I also found joking being recorded by the studio employees between Native people, making fun of the parts, making fun of their lines, making fun of the storyline right. with each other, making fun, a lot of intertribal jokes too, like, oh, I'm falling off my horse so much because I'm playing a person of tribe X. That would never happen if it was my tribe because we would never fall off horses, right? So that's, to me, another way of Native people sort of saying these images are totally ridiculous. Mm-hmm. Jay Silverheels, that was his stage name, was Jay Silverheels. He's the man on the cover of the book. His birth name's Harry Smith. He's from Six Nations. He's a Mohawk man. He definitely tried to reform the industry in terms of advocating for his own self, being in a sort of more dignified role, trying to influence the costuming, trying to make more money. Of course, he wasn't listened to. Mm-hmm. Once he was a bit older, he created an Indian Actors Workshop, and there's a great little documentary you can watch on Prime, Amazon Prime, The Evil Empire, called the Indian Actors Workshop. So he did create a workshop where he was training Native people living in LA in the method of acting and bringing in actors to teach them. And his intention was for them to get hired for true parts that required acting.
Well, the book is about, mostly post-World War II films. Did you notice any major transformation in the films from the 30s, the way that the studios dealt with this sort of treatment of Native Americans and also hiring and the work conditions versus all the way up to 1960?
Yeah, what I noticed is that, like, for instance, Professor Joanna Hearn, she's written extensively on Native people in movies, as well as Michelle Rehaja, as well as Professor Marubio. And what they found is that Native people definitely had more influence and more power in the early 20th century than they did in the mid 20th century. So that's sort of why I wanted to write on the mid 20th century. I wanted sort of look at the sort of worst moment in the history of Native people in film to see sort of what's really going on there. So prior to the 1940s, there were in fact a handful of Native people who had somewhat prominent roles in Hollywood. There were a handful of Native producers, writers, directors. That just absolutely ended by the 40s and 50s. That was absolutely over. And I did see an increase in friendship films after World War II, meaning movies about male friendships. So friendships between lead white male characters and significant Indian male characters, like Broken Arrow, for instance.
Sure.
But, yes, exactly. And I think we're all familiar with that. And I think that sort of parallels what's going on in representations of African Americans as well. And I think that's a direct outcome of World War II.
Right. Well, that's very fascinating. Is it because, or do you think, or is there any evidence that it was because a lot of white Americans would have come across African Americans or Native Americans really for the first time in service in World War II? Is there any evidence of that?
That's possible. The number of Native men enlisting in the military far exceeds anyone else in some communities. Virtually every man who was alive made his way down to voluntarily register to draft. So certainly Native American participation in the war as soldiers was immense, and that could have increased that contact between non-Native men and Native men through the military. But it seems that it's also just there's a cultural shift in the United States after the war in terms of thinking about race and culture and ethnicity.
Now, as a final question, I was told to ask you this by several of our listeners. Did you get to meet any of these actors? Now, they would be very old, presumably, because you're talking about actors who were working in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. But were you able to do any oral interviews or things like that with them?
I did a few interviews over the phone. I didn't actually travel to meet them, but I did some interviews over the phone with a couple of people. I found some oral histories that had been done by other faculty that they shared with me. That's all in the book. I corresponded extensively with a Creek man named Cecil Mears, whose picture is not in the book, unfortunately, because the picture was so, the quality of the picture wasn't high enough for the press's standards. And in fact, to that end, we should talk about the photos in my book.
Well, Professor, the book is, of course, called Picturing Indians, but there's a problem. How many actual pictures, how many images were you able to use and bring into the book?
Thank you for asking. There are 2 pictures in the book because Universal Studios was the only studio willing to work with me on these images.
Really?
So yes, Universal Studios was extremely cooperative. Not only they are actually the ones that created the photos in the book. Even though I had possession of those photos, they wanted to make sure that they were really high resolution. So they went in to the movie itself, like their very high resolution, version of the film, and they created those images for me from Winchester 73. They were very, very helpful. They did not question me about what I was using them for. I mean, in terms of what exactly are you saying about our movies? They did not ask me that. Warner Brothers, on the other hand, made my life a living hell. So I had a book contract with Harvard University Press.
Yeah.
When I had that book contract, they gave me full written permission to publish all of these images in my book. I gave up that contract because I became a mom and I was a stay-at-home mom for a while. Sure. Then when I came back to academia, I got a new contract with a new press. Well, as this book was going into production, I thought, well, maybe we should make sure I can still publish these books.
Publish these pictures, yeah.
Yes, publish these pictures. Sorry, I'm getting upset at that.
No,
I'm getting emotional as I tell this story.
It's good because buzzkillers never hear the background, the backstory to a lot of these.
See, this is the behind the scenes
things.
Look at my behind the scenes
book.
Right,
exactly.
So I start talking with them. They won't reply to me.
Doing your due diligence for copyright reasons.
Even though I have a contract with them that says I can publish it, but it says Harvard University Press. So I start emailing them. They won't reply. I'm telling my friends they're not replying, and my book deadline is coming up.
Yeah.
My friends say, hire a legal permission group whose job is to get legal permission. Fine. I hire them. I spent more than $1,000 paying these people for numerous hours of correspondence with Warner Brothers, who would just come back to them with questions. And then the group would come to me with those questions, like all sorts of questions. Warner Brothers ended up reading the entire book.
Yeah.
And once they had read the book, well, at some point in this process with this legal permissions group, they put in writing in an email, we will give her permission.
Yeah.
Right? They said that in an email. And then I said, we have to have a contract, like the one they gave me before with Harvard. I need a contract saying I can use them. I mean, I already owned the images. I had the stills of the images that I purchased from the archives. I did not need the images. I just needed them to say they can be in the book. So literally weeks, the production process had already begun.
Right.
Weeks before the book was actually being printed as physical matter, they emailed the legal permissions group I hired and said, in writing, we revoke her right to publish any of these images.
That's shocking.
And my editor, my press, the legal department, they all at UNP Press, they all went out to them and begged them and explained to them that this is an academic book, that this is that I'm actually making them look good because I'm saying they hired Native people.
Right.
And they still said no. So I have an author website that people can go to.
We'll put the link to that
see
on
all
the
images
on the blog post.
that aren't in the book. Yeah.
Well, this sort of, it's interesting because your labor, your work as an historian is kind of like being paralleled with the labor and work of the people in the movies you were analyzing.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Well, as I say, our listeners almost never get this sort of background info on how difficult it is sometimes to deal with things. You would think that Warner Brothers wouldn't have any problem with of images from the 40s and 50s. It's not like first of all, you weren't critiquing them, but second of all, it's not like you're trying to ruin their next box office opening.
I mean, what's interesting about the pictures in particular is that, well, first of all, they took these pictures.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They took these pictures. They had guys on set with cameras to take pictures of what was happening on set, right? Like not video cameras, still cameras to document the set,
right? Yeah.
And to use that as publicity material. So they're the ones that took these pictures. Then they're the ones that printed these pictures. Then they're the ones that took those pictures and sent them to their archives. So it's their material, okay?
Yeah,
what I did with those pictures is I told this other story. So instead of just saying this is what happened to in these movies and here's what I think about these movies, which is what a lot of film historians do, I looked at the records. So I treated those photographs as part of the archive, as part of the record, to say there's more going on in the movies than we thought.
Yeah.
And yet they, well, I don't know what their thinking was because they never explained, but I was showing that they hired Native people, and I was showing there was a different story happening on set through those photographs. That what is the point of saving the photographs if they don't want researchers to use them?
Well, exactly. And so Buzzkillers should definitely, in addition to getting the book, which of course is on the Buzzkill Book Show, and available to our Patreon members, you should go to the blog, and which we'll put the link to on our blog post about the episode, to look at these pictures that we're talking about. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much, Professor, for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And we hope that you be willing to come on the show again when your next book gets close to coming out.
Absolutely.
And Buzzkillers, we will talk to all of you next week.